Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the July event of Newcastle Institute. You'll notice that we've lost a screen over here. So for those of you who would like, it might be easier to come over this side to be able to see this screen a little easier. I'm Robert Logan, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you here tonight. I'd also like to welcome those watching online, and a special welcome to Dr. Bin Lee. I'm pointing at the camera, who's from the University of Newcastle, but he's watching from the Baltic port city of Gdansk. So we've gone international, and we have people interested in these issues from all around the world. We know we have regular people watching in Brisbane, in Melbourne, Sydney, and especially, interestingly enough, Canberra. So welcome to you, Ben, from Gdansk. Newcastle Institute was formed in 2004 to provide a forum for dialogue and discussion of important issues related to public policy. We pay our respects to the Awabakal and the Worimi peoples who have shared learning and ideas for thousands of years here in Newcastle. And we also thank all of those who continue to make Newcastle a place of learning, a place of discovery, and a place of ideas. Tonight our guest is Professor Roy Green. Roy is the chair of the Port of Newcastle. He's also Emeritus Professor of Innovation at the University of Technology, Sydney, and he also holds a long list of other very prestigious positions, which is too long to mention, but we're enormously privileged to have Roy with us tonight. Newcastle impacts all of us in a variety of ways: economically, socially, recreationally, physically, environmentally, and it is our home. Newcastle was recently voted number 9 in the top 10 best lesser-known places in the world to visit. We came in at number 9. Tasmania came in at number 7, but we scraped into the top 10 of the lesser-known places in the world. And central to our beautiful city is the port. It's been in the news a bit over the last few years, and to tell us what's happening and plans for the future, there's no one better placed than Professor Roy Green. Roy will speak for 30-40 minutes, and then it's your turn for questions. Would you please join me in welcome Professor Roy Green?
So thanks very much for inviting me. I hope the result of all of our endeavours at the port will make us better known and to be in those rankings. But let me begin by acknowledging the Awabakal and Worimi people, who are the traditional custodians of the land and the waters here around Newcastle, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Of course, in 60,000 years of history, Newcastle and its port is just a blip, but it's an important one. Where can we get the slides back? Thank you. There we go. There we go. So it's an important history, even though we may be a blip in the 60,000 years that preceded us. It's fundamentally based on coal and steel and industry. The people who came here and settled in Newcastle built one of the most extraordinary ports in the world, which has now become the world's largest coal export port. But it started here 220 years ago. This is how it developed over the 19th century to become a formidable enterprise, together ultimately with the steel industry and BHP. We had these coal ships so-called 60 milers, 60 nautical miles, because their market was Sydney, and the energy industry in Sydney as well as Newcastle was where most of the coal ended up. But these days, it's an extremely formidable enterprise, doing almost $50 billion of trade. That's the whole trade that passes through the port, 150 million tonnes of volume a year, and that volume is primarily coal. It's a funny bit of feedback here. I hope that isn't too disconcerting. Maybe I'll pull this around a bit like this. So we do a lot of other trade as well, anything from manganese to critical minerals to ammonia, but 85% of the port's volume is coal. And this is where the port started, but our objective is to make sure it is not where the port finishes, because we want to diversify beyond coal into other trades to ensure that the port and its region have a diversified future where we become something a bit more like the Ruhr than Appalachia. The coal industry is going through a transition all over the world, and some regions are managing this well. The Ruhr in Germany, where not a single job was lost. Some of the jobs were obviously changed, but in net terms, not a single job was lost, compared with Appalachia in the US, where there was no management of the transition process. Many jobs were lost, communities were destroyed, and anyone who had an entrepreneurial spirit had to move somewhere to the southwest, to Arizona. But in the broader context of the Australian economy, we do face a critical juncture because, like Newcastle and the Hunter itself, Australia's industrial structure and its trade structure is very narrow, as we all know, based very heavily on the export of unprocessed raw materials. And this underlies a deeper problem, which is stalled productivity, and mixed up now with the need to address climate change, we have an incredible opportunity to reshape our economy. But in order to do so, we do need government to be very much involved, and government has stepped in recently with the Future Made in Australia initiative, which has a number of components, but they're essentially built around achieving net zero, addressing climate change with a restructuring of our economy to ensure that we're producing low carbon products and ultimately net zero emissions. And the second piece is the so-called economic resilience stream. Both streams absolutely essential to reshaping our economy and improving productivity and hence living standards. We had the OECD numbers just the other day pointing out that we're right at the back of the OECD when it comes to improving people's incomes. In fact, real incomes have gone backwards here since the COVID period, whereas in other countries they've gone ahead. This is highly related to stalled productivity and our inability to move beyond a resources-based economy to higher value-adding products and services. This is how it looks from a piece of work that is carried out in Harvard every year. It's called the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity. And yes, it's a complex diagram, but what it shows, if you look at the piece up here, is that the German economy, which is number 4 on that ranking in the world. Japan is number 1, Switzerland number 2. Those pieces on the left-hand side are all about high value adding, high skill, high productivity activities in not just the car industry, but pharmaceuticals, medical manufacturing, and so on. Very few areas here have anything to do with the production of natural resources, digging things up or cutting things down and selling them in their raw state. When we look at a country a bit more like us, we're never going to be Germany, but a bit more like us, Canada, which is number 41 on this list of 133 countries, it does quite a bit of raw material export here, mainly in oil, gas, but also coal. But it does have quite a bit of manufacturing going on over here. And so it's a reasonably balanced economy, despite being very dependent on the export of raw materials. We come to Australia, we're number 93 out of 133 countries, just behind Uganda. And as you can see, we're all about coal and iron ore. A little bit of manufacturing left. It was around 30% of our economy in the 1960s and 70s. It's now at 6%. Other countries like Germany are around 20%. Some have more, some a bit less. But those are economies which recognise that to achieve economic complexity and diversity, you need to have a manufacturing component to your economic activity. This ranking measures both the diversity and the research intensity of national economies. So we don't have very much to be proud of here, but we have maintained our living standards to some extent by relying on high commodity prices, especially during the commodity boom, which increased our living standards by 15% over a 6-year period. And we've gone backwards since then because prices have declined. And we can only imagine what would be the case if we faced an external shock, the removal, for example, of our iron ore exports. And certainly we know coal over the next 15 years to come is going to be in structural decline. And so what will fill the gap that is created in this part of our export mix? What will create the value to do this? And we don't really have the answers at this stage, but if we are to provide the answers, they're probably going to come from the Hunter region, because we're the first to be going through this major process of economic diversification and energy transition. And this is where the port needs to play a very big role. So here we have just a comparison of Australia sort of moving down the table here. Look at Vietnam, and Canada is also sliding a bit, but it's still at number 41. That's the serious prospect that we have ahead of us. And we have on top of that the need to address climate change and to change our export mix in that context to low carbon products. We can't rely heavily on non-renewable natural resources to create a new economy. We need to find sources of value in knowledge-based products and services. And this goes to the role of the port, because this port has relied for 200 years on essentially unprocessed raw material exports, mainly coal. When we look at the precincts here, it's all about bulk products. It's not about containers. It's about bulk products, apart from coal, some grain, some critical minerals, But what we can do in the future is really based on two areas that we have not yet made very much use of. One is the Mayfield site, and the other is this area on Kooragang Island, which was to be another coal terminal, but we have converted it to become a Clean Energy Precinct. The Mayfield site, as many of you will know, and you will have heard this over the last few years, I was last talking to this group in 2018 when I was recently appointed as chair of the port, and we noted that in the period just after the steel closure in 1999, the closure of the steel blast furnace, a negotiation had taken place with government and BHP to convert the Mayfield site into New South Wales' second container terminal after Port Botany. But obviously, 24 years later, that has not happened, and it hadn't happened in 2018. It's still an empty site. And the reasons for that are complex over that 24-year period, but essentially, after lots of delays and obstruction during the period leading up to 2012-13, a commercial proposal was put to the government for the development of a competitive, automated, large-scale container port. The proposal was rejected because the government at that time had decided to privatise the three major New South Wales ports, Port Botany, Kembla and Newcastle. And it did so by incorporating the so-called Port Commitment Deed, which placed a penalty on the Port of Newcastle for every container that it produced or that it transported over 30,000 TEUs. That's 20-foot equivalent units, the standard unit for containers. 30,000 containers is about 3 ships, 2 or 3 ships. So for every box that we transported, if we had a container terminal over 30,000 TEUs, we would pay to our competitors $100 a box. So if we did 1 million containers, which is about standard for a regional port, we would be paying our competitors $100 million a year, which didn't make the development of a container terminal at Newcastle look very commercially viable. And it was clearly an anti-competitive provision to boost the sale price of Port Botany to make the then government's privatisation and asset recycling program look good. Wasn't Mike Baird wonderful? Look at how he had boosted the sale price of Port Botany from 3 billion to 5 billion over a 5-month period of discussion. Little did anyone know at the time that the reason for this increase in price was the imposition of an anti-competitive restriction on a potential competitor port, namely Newcastle. This all came out, as many of you will know, in the media over subsequent years. The owners who took over the Port of Newcastle were not too distressed about this at the time because coal was still going up. The promise was that the port would be shipping maybe 180, 200 million tonnes from where it was at the time, around 160 million. Well, things didn't work out that way, which I guess some people could have predicted. It went backwards, and we're now doing around 135 million tonnes, and the future looks like a downward trajectory, with some spikes along the way, because with the Ukraine war and various other things, it was useful to have coal in reserve in many countries. But ultimately, we have to be prepared for a day when the market is not going to support the sort of coal volumes that we have at the present time. Once the owners recognised this, to their credit, they instigated a program of change, which I was very pleased to be part of, and we introduced a new strategy to the port, which was number one, to remove the anti-competitive port commitment deed so that we could develop a commercial scale container terminal. Well, I think in 2018 I said, this is not going to be easy because it's embedded in the policy of the then New South Wales government, and it wasn't easy. We're still here 6 years later, but we have removed the port commitment deed. How did this happen? Well, not through rational argument. It required a power play. We did actually have support from the Commonwealth government, who felt, even under the Morrison regime, that this was antithetical to Liberal Party philosophy to have these anti-competitive practices. But he was not really in a position to do very much about it. He came pretty close to buying out the port commitment deed from the state government. That was a proposition that was circulated for a while, but it didn't come to anything. But during the dying days of the Perrottet government, that was our moment to strike, because he had two members in the sin bin, which reduced him to a minority in the lower house. And that's when our wonderful independent member, Greg Piper, struck with his Port of Newcastle Extinguishment of Liability Bill, which had only one line in it. The port commitment deed from this moment on is extinguished. So he submitted this to Parliament. Within like 5 minutes, we had the Treasurer on the line. It's probably time we talked. He said, yep, we've been waiting 6 years for this. And an interesting deal was done, which was, and a very fair deal was done with Matt Keane, who has been a great supporter of Newcastle and its port. The deal was to ask the question, what would the owners of the Port of Newcastle have paid in 2014 had the restriction not existed? That question was put to IPART, the independent competition regulator. So they went away to work this out. Port Botany put in a submission saying, oh, it'd be at least 2 billion. They'd have to pay at least 2 billion because that was the premium we paid when we bought the monopoly port. Even though they said when we were asking for the port commitment deed to be removed, it's not worth anything, they can never develop a container port. So work out that contradiction. Nevertheless, IPART last year came up with its determination, and that was much lower than we thought. We thought maybe 50 million, but they determined it to be 13 million, partly because the coal volume estimates in 2014 were wildly optimistic. So that's how they valued the port, and under the provisions designed within this new piece of legislation, if we paid that 13 million, the port commitment deed would be removed immediately, and that's what's happened. So that's gone, and we now have an opportunity to develop this new large-scale deep water container port. I'll come back to that in a moment, because we also have the other proposition. While we were agitating for the port commitment deed to be removed, we weren't sitting on our hands counting the ships. We recognised that as part of the energy transition, ports have a role to play. And the role that we could play was by developing a hydrogen hub. And we're recognised in Australia by the Commonwealth Government as the major hydrogen hub, certainly for New South Wales, and we believe that we have a better chance of implementing a hydrogen hub facility than anywhere else in Australia. Because if you look at the hydrogen hubs that have been nominated, Gladstone, Whyalla, Pilbara, they all have something that is essential to becoming a hydrogen production facility. But the advantage of Newcastle is that it has everything. It has the port, it has the transmission grid, it has a university, it has the CSIRO Energy Centre, it has pipelines, and it will be connected to offshore wind. And I'll come back to that as well, because that will supply the electrons that enable the hydrogen production facility to work and to be competitive even with what we now understand to be the global positioning around the Biden legislation, which provided production credits to hydrogen producers in the US. So those are the two streams of diversification activity that we've been working on since we last met in 2018, and I'm glad to say that they are all proceeding, but everything takes time. We're not there yet. So the writing there has disappeared. What that said was Newcastle Deepwater Container Terminal, NDCD. So why do we want to do a container terminal? Because 95% of non-bulk products in the world today are moved by containers. If you are a port that is still stuck with bulk products, you are a port that will go nowhere, especially if you're reliant on coal. And there have been a number of coal ports around the world that have repositioned themselves in this context. Ports on the east coast of the UK, for example, are now basing their business models on alternative energy sources, as well as containers. And that's where we want to go. So now that we have the opportunity to do a massive investment in containers, it will be $2.5 to $3 billion to get this up. We will then be in a position to be a challenger port on the east coast of Australia. And I'll come back to what that means in a moment in the context of our site. And I do mention, if Ben Lee is watching from Gdansk, he should ask around there, how did Gdansk fare in setting up a challenger port on the Baltic coast? It worked brilliantly well because they were able to invest in the latest technology to automate their port. They had great access to the port. They had a very efficient intermodal operation, and they're now one of the most competitive ports on the whole North Sea and Baltic coast. And we see the Port of Newcastle in that context on the east coast of Australia. It's not widely known that the east coast ports in Australia, particularly Port Botany, are in the bottom 10% of global port productivity, the bottom 10%. And why is that the case? It's because of not exactly antiquated equipment, because they're bolting on automation, but congestion, poor infrastructure. The intermodals in Port Botany are 40 kilometres away from the port, so there's double handling. And of course, all the congestion that arises when you're a port in a growing city. And in most parts of the world, when the city outgrows the port moves. Gdansk is a good example. Another example closer to home is Port Tauranga in New Zealand, where the New Zealand government decided, look, Auckland is getting congested, we'll build a new port outside of Auckland at Tauranga, 150 kilometres away, about the same distance as Newcastle is from Sydney. It has deep water access, it has an adjacent intermodal, it has rail connectivity, it's automated, all the things we can do here. And you might ask why I emphasise the deep water aspect, because if you have a deep water port, you can accommodate the ultra-large container vessels, which are now the most prominent productivity-enhancing aspect of world shipping. These are vessels, gigantic, up to 24,000 TEUs. The sort of vessels that are going to Port Botany, Brisbane and Melbourne are the sort of vessels that are being phased out around the world, between 10 and 12,000 TEUs. The world in the future will belong to hub and spoke systems, and that means very large vessels with much smaller ones, 3,000 to 4,000 TEUs as feeder vessels along the coastline. So Newcastle is in the very fortunate position of having deep water access. It's in the very fortunate position of having a huge amount of land available, flat, hard stand for container terminal site. That's the Carrington, that's the Carrington coal terminal next door to Mayfield. That will ultimately move over to Kooragang Island, creating even more space. At the moment, the Mayfield site is simply used to import wind turbines, which is a good thing for onshore renewable energy, but it's only using a very small proportion of the site over here. And then over here, we've just installed 2 mobile harbour cranes for small amounts of containers for grain handling and so on, because even bulk products like grain, metal products, they're all getting containerised. So relying on those as a future income stream from the port would be a very short-sighted thing to do as well. But the mobile harbour cranes are there just as a transition measure. Ultimately, a container port looks like this, and those kind of cranes are called key cranes because they are automated operations with a direct link into an intermodal facility and ultimately in Newcastle to the rail network. I was in Hamburg recently where I saw one of these large vessels, around 14,000, 15,000 TEUs being unloaded, and it's amazing to see 5 key cranes at work at once unloading a vessel of 14,000 TEUs. They take the boxes off the vessel every 12 seconds, and so within 48 hours the vessel is emptied and out it goes again and another replaces it. But if you go down the road, as it were, a little bit west to Wilhelmshaven, where they have a relatively new growing port, they say, that's nothing. We can probably half that to maybe 6-8 seconds because we're introducing new forms of automation, and we have a deep water access, whereas Hamburg does not have deep water access. It has the Elbe, which is a river, and constantly have to dredge it, whereas at Wilhelmshaven they have a natural sort of estuary there which keeps the deep water aspect available to them without all that much dredging. And so they think they can be the challenger port to Hamburg, which is the biggest port on the North Sea coast. Very ambitious, plus they're going to do hydrogen and offshore wind. So they're currently where we would like to be in 5 to 10 years. They're probably 5 to 10 years ahead of us. And so that's what we think we can do here with, firstly, the hinterland, where we have grain products, cotton, all sorts of products that are currently not just going through Port Botany, but through Melbourne and Brisbane, because Port Botany is so choked and expensive and slow. For example, if you talk to cotton farmers around Narrabri and Moree, they will tell you that 50% of their product is now taken by truck to Melbourne and containerised on the port for export, when Newcastle is a couple of 100 kilometres away on a rail line. And sometimes with grain, the grain that we receive at the port in bulk form is containerised on our port and sent to Port Botany, because we can't do the containers. We don't have the shipping line. So the potential for us is huge, as well as having rail access, including to inland rail, which no other port on the east coast will have. Believe it or not, inland rail will not have rail access to either Port Melbourne or Brisbane. It's going to stop short of both ports for various geological reasons, but it will come straight into Newcastle. So another tremendous competitive advantage. We'll start with a relatively small operation, which will take care of all the grain, the cotton, other products in the Upper Hunter and northern New South Wales region. That will give us a port around 350,000 TEUs. That's enough to make us commercially viable once we get the key cranes established, but only perhaps a few of them at this stage. And we'll be cutting the costs for rural exporters by 30 to 50% for transport. The next stage, we move up to something over 1 million containers, and we've got plenty of room to do that with additional key cranes. And this starts to eat Port Botany's lunch. We will be able to attract companies and distribution centres in Western Sydney who are fed up with going by truck mainly. 80% of the traffic between the intermodals and Port Botany are by truck, even though they're talking about increasing rail access at great taxpayer expense, I hasten to add. The point being that those distribution centres, manufacturing companies in Western Sydney will have much better, more efficient access to Newcastle than they will 40 kilometres away at Port Botany. That's the point at which this becomes a very significant port for the whole East Coast. And sometimes you'll hear it said, and I don't hear it said so much these days by the proponents of Port Botany, ships will only stop once on the east coast of Australia. In other words, to imply that they won't stop at Newcastle. But now they won't say that anymore because they recognise that if they only stop once, it'll be here. Not necessarily at Port Botany, but we would, in accommodating the ultra-large container vessels, have feeder vessels around the coast to Botany, Brisbane. That's a long shot, and ultimately we want to get up to 2 million containers, and then we're a very major port for the East Coast. We can go even further than that, but I think the key thing here is to have a balance between ports. We're in competition, but we also have to cooperate to some degree as well, in order that traffic flows freely up and down the Blue Highway, as it were. And by stopping around 2 or 3 million containers, we make sure that there's still plenty of traffic going into the other ports as well, as there must be because they have large population centres. But over 30% of exports, for example, in New South Wales are generated within the Hunter and the northern region. So we're going to get very significant traffic here. And this is where we'd like to be in 10 to 15 years' time in terms of the container port proposition. And I'm happy to discuss any of those issues as we go into questions and discussion. But Before we get there, I just want to say a few words also about the Clean Energy program. As I said, this is a development of more recent times on the so-called T4 site at the northern end of Kooragang Island, northwestern end, which was intended to be a coal terminal, but there isn't the volume now to sustain one. And so, perfect opportunity to take a piece of land which is unremediated. BHP dumped a whole lot of stuff there over the century, and so there's a lot of fixing up to do. But it's recognised by the Commonwealth as the best place for the development of a hydrogen production facility involving electrolyser components, some of which we can make here, and that's what we're hoping to do. I'll come back to that local content piece in a moment. But the idea is that we have to first remediate the site, and Chris Bowen, the Energy Minister, has provided us with $100 million to do that as a start. We also have partnerships with a number of Japanese and Korean firms who want to be in there. They'd like us to export hydrogen in one form or another, possibly ammonia, possibly methanol. Europe would like this as well, but we have to be clear about what we want to do with hydrogen. We don't just want to be the raw material exporting something else. We want to make use of hydrogen to rebuild our manufacturing in Australia. And I'll come back to that, but the point is that these Japanese and Korean companies have made applications under the government's $2 billion Hydrogen Head Start program, and out of the 5 shortlisted projects around Australia, Newcastle has 2. So that's where we stand with the federal government. Globally, what's all this worth? Quite a lot. $2 or $3 trillion by the year 2026, and this is a bit of an old piece there, but it's just showing you the trend between fossil fuel investments and clean energy investments. The assessment is that by 2050, clean energy industries will be worth $15 trillion. So it's an area that is worthwhile engaging with, and we can do so here in Newcastle. I'll come to a bigger map, and what you see there is the port, the Clean Energy Precinct up here, and a whole lot of activity around, which is essentially taking electrons from the offshore wind project and from solar and onshore wind activities, and using that energy to be the fuel for the hydrogen electrolyser process. The offshore wind announcement the other day, which you may be aware of, has positioned the big Norwegian company Equinor together with its Australian partner OceanX as the developer of an offshore wind floating platform site, 25 kilometres offshore. You won't even see them. And this will generate 2 to 3 gigawatts of electricity, which is sufficient to power the hydrogen electrolyser facility, and ultimately, but in the first instance, probably more for ammonia production to replace gas, carbon components of ammonia, for fertiliser and explosives and so on. That's the easy part. The next part will be, and we might export some on the way if the Japanese and Korean companies are keen to do so, but the next part for Newcastle, which will be of most interest, will be building partnerships with companies that want to do green iron and green steel. That's the vision that we want to see activated in Newcastle. And as you may know, the GFG Alliance owns the old InfraBuild site, has an interest in doing green iron and green steel, and it's right on this next to the Mayfield site at the port. So we have an enormous opportunity there to revive steelmaking in Newcastle, should GFG Alliance be interested enough to invest, to develop an electric arc furnace, and then we have the flow-on effects to Newcastle manufacturing. We also have some immediate impact for Newcastle manufacturing, because in Equinor bringing these offshore floating platforms for the production of electricity, we have to build these platforms onshore. We have, these are so huge, I don't think anyone's quite grasped the requirements that we will have in producing platforms that will require 4,000 welders and the equivalent of the entire annual output of BlueScope steel. This is an enormous jobs and future industries opportunity for Newcastle, which is yet to occur. I'm getting a signal to wind up, so I will. This is where we are. This is my last slide. And we can see there big job numbers around the container terminal. We can create a number of 20,000 jobs, 4 or 5 billion of added value for the economy, 2 or 3 for Newcastle, similarly with clean energy. So we are obviously at a big turning point for the city and for the region, because we're doing this first. We're the first in Australia to do this enormous economic transformation of a region in conjunction with all of our partners, all of the businesses in Hunter Net, all the international companies that want to be here, the billions of dollars that they wish to invest in this region, and with the prospect of becoming an exemplar of economic diversification and energy transition. So the message there is the port has a great future, but it will take a bit of time to get there, because in the case, I should mention, in the case of the container terminal, we have to go still through a big process with the state government, given that the last government set up a ports and freight plan that basically excluded Newcastle. They've asked Kerry Schott, who may be known to some of you, very independent investor and academic, and a great history associated with the transport and freight sector, to do an independent review of that plan and come back with one that can provide planning approvals for the Port of Newcastle when we undertake all of these very ambitious investments. So I'm very happy to take any questions or discuss any of those issues.
Thanks very much, Roy. It's your turn. There's going to be some questions. There's a couple of microphones that will go around. If you have a question, can I just ask you to stand up and ask it when you get the microphone? But I might ask the first question, Roy. Newcastle Harbour and the port is quite unique in that it shares a very a major commercial port with a lot of recreational users. If the port is currently operating at about 50%, if that increases, what's the likely impact on recreational users for our beautiful port?
Well, the short answer is none. We use 50% of the capacity of the port at present for the current coal shipments. If we did containers as well, we would increase it by another 20% possibly, because containers are not going to be as frequent as the coal ships. 20% might be even exaggerating, but there will still be abundant space for recreational yachting and boating, absolutely no question of that. And all the scheduling is managed very successfully at the moment and will be into the future.
Thank you. We have a question over in the corner over here. If you just stand up and if you can, please, if that's possible.
Yeah, Jeff Coates, you mentioned that to be viable, the container terminal has to have about 1 million containers a year, which works out about 20,000 containers a week. How much work has been done on the transport side of that? Is it mostly going by rail or truck, or does it mean we've got to upgrade the rail network to handle that many containers?
Yeah, very good question. And as you can imagine, a lot of work is going into the land side. What we intend for this port to be is a port based on rail connectivity. There may be some truck movements, can't rule that out, for small scale transport in the city and immediate environs, but 85–90% we're planning will be on rail, and the question then leads to, is the rail system adequate for purpose? It is up to 1 million. Beyond 1 million it's not. So up to 1 million with some tweaking around Moree for a 22-kilometre stretch that still needs to be created, and the state government is very sympathetic to doing that with ARTC. The next stage after we get 1 million containers operating through the port is a dedicated rail freight line to Western Sydney. Now that is being investigated at the moment in conjunction with the high-speed rail proposition, because if we're to do high-speed rail, not quite sure how high the speed would be, I think there's some controversy about that, let's call it less slow rail, there would be a new rail line next to which would be constructed the freight rail. So we make use of the land that's set aside for that purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. Further to the rail, how would the bypass, the proposed freight rail bypass and the linking from the new container terminal into the main rail network, how is that all going to be funded? As a Commonwealth state, does the port contribute? What's the basis of funding it?
Yeah, so funding hasn't been determined at this stage. That's yet to come. That's going to be an interesting discussion with the Commonwealth and the state, because there's clearly growth, jobs and productivity benefits in what we're doing. So what I would imagine is that it would be a co-investment. We're talking to ARTC all the time, and submissions will be made to government, and we know we have a Prime Minister who's vitally interested in infrastructure.
Paul from Newcastle Cruising Yacht Club.
Hiya, Paul.
I was just at a marina conference in Queensland a couple of months ago, and they're talking about a massive demand for super yachts coming to Australia. There's a lot of them being built at the moment, and there's nowhere in Sydney for them to go. In terms of diversification and your precincts, there's a tiny little one at the bottom called Marine Precinct Industry. I imagine that's a fairly low-hanging fruit and probably not as expensive and as long-term to develop as some of those other massive projects. Is there any other impediments to moving that sort of precinct forward?
I don't know of any, but then again, I haven't really asked that question. I think that would be a great proposition to take up with the port if you want to speak with the CEO, Craig Carmody. I think he's the one to answer that question. We've undertaken a strategic land use study of the whole 900 hectares of the port, which has never been done in the past. It's just been allowed under public ownership previous to privatisation to just develop in whatever way people felt like at the time. So there's a lot of incoherence, a lot of bizarre, isolated tendencies that don't make any sense, that don't bring any income into the port, and we're just going through them one by one to sort out what works for the port and what doesn't. And in that context, that would be a great opportunity to think through what happens with super yachts if we want to create a space for them. There's plenty of space. It's just a question of where it would happen.
Hi, Roy.
Yeah, hi,
Giles.
Greg.
Look, first of all, Roy, it's so great to come to a place here, to a presentation here in Newcastle where we've got a leader of industry who owns a huge asset that's basically makes its money out of fossil fuel exports, that's actually standing up and putting a positive view of our future and explaining and planning on how to move from that dependence upon fossil fuels to a continually thriving port and industrial sector that's converted to renewables. And I think that's really exciting, and it's really good to see you standing up here and saying it, because it's very rare, I can assure you now. But I guess that going with that, I've got a bit of a concern about the hydrogen hub. I mean, I think it's an emerging area and it's very difficult to predict, and it's really exciting that we're getting in first and being able to do a lot of the research and the upscaling that's going to be needed and to apply to industry. But it is extraordinarily energy hungry. What people have to realise is that for hydrogen to be produced, it actually needs to use a huge amount of renewable energy, much more than it actually produces at the other end. And at a time when as a nation and as a city, we're trying to electrify everything and go to renewables, whether or not the priority call or the first call on our offshore wind farm or our new solar farms should be an export hydrogen industry, or to meet those huge new demands for electric vehicles and heat pump hot water systems and so on. So I'm just wondering how, in a strategic sense, you balance all of that out to make sure that, you know, you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul, or putting us in the position we are now where we've got a gas shortage because we're actually exporting it all overseas rather than using it here.
No, exactly. No, that's a really good point. And there has to be a balance there, because we do want electrification as we run down and cease to operate coal-fired power stations. We've got to get the electrons from somewhere, and it would be partly onshore renewable energy production, solar and wind. It'll be partly the offshore. So I can imagine that a component of that offshore wind energy is going to go into the transmission grid. What proportion that is and where hydrogen fits into the clean energy future is being determined gradually as the world changes in front of us. I was at the World Hydrogen Summit in Rotterdam a few months ago, and 15,000 people attending, which was double the amount the previous year and double again the year before. So when you get there, you see like 1,000 stands of all these very clever people selling hydrogen technologies, all saying ours is the one that will work for you. It's a bit like the start of video recording, except rather than just two, there's hundreds, thousands of possible technology routes that we can go down. And so it's incredibly complex, and how that sorting out will take place in the market and by government policy remains to be seen. But we're going to be open to everything, you know. We just want it to be sufficiently flexible so that there can be something for the transmission grid if we need it. For example, Tomago uses about a third of the energy of New South Wales. That's got to keep going, and that would be a priority to make sure it does. How much hydrogen, how much electrons directly from offshore wind will count for that remains to be seen. And then we've got the hydrogen export opportunity. That's not number one on the list. I think before that we use hydrogen for the green iron, green steel possibility. But that's just my opinion.
Yes, I add my thanks for a fantastic talk. I didn't know a lot of the things that you've shared with us tonight. But still, I've got friends that work in the coal mines and people who drive tugs and friends who. You're obviously a big thinker about all sorts of issues. What do you think is going to happen about coal? We've got people getting on top of coal trains and all that in Newcastle. But what's from a quiet perspective, what do you think the future of coal export will be from Newcastle?
Yeah, it's very hard to know at this point. A couple of years ago, the trajectory was far sharper downwards than it is today. A number of the coal producers are keeping their mines open for longer than they'd planned. One producer that was planning for 2035 has extended it. So it's anyone's guess. All we know is that by around 2050, there won't be terribly much coal being produced and exported from here. And that's not a huge way off. But the fact is that if coal is not being exported from anywhere else in the world by that time, the one place where it could still be exported from is here because of the quality of the coal. The market wants Hunter grade black thermal coal, and we produce some metallurgical coal as well that will go on a lot longer than thermal coal because that's used in steel making. But the thermal coal prospect, I think, will reach, this is my guess, an end around 2050, but not entirely an end. There will still be some boutique production of this high quality coal, even when every other coal port in the world has ceased its operation. The main thing is that we have alternative job opportunities for people in the mines, and I think we can deliver on that literally in spades, provided we can do the projects that we've set out here in the clean energy stream and the container activity, and that if we moved, and this is something that would concern people who work at the port itself, if we move to a more automated operation, and I know the MUA is always a bit concerned about loss of jobs in that context, what we say to the MUA and to unions generally is that, okay, there won't be many new jobs at the port, and those jobs that do get offered will be different ones, possibly higher skill, hopefully higher wage jobs, but there won't be many of them. The important thing for everyone to understand, however, is that in the supply chain for a container port and for clean energy, there will be thousands of other jobs around computer programming, warehousing, supply chain management, renewable energy production. I don't think in the future we'll be worried about lack of jobs. What will worry us are skill shortages.
I'm not sure that this is true, and it's exciting to hear all your ideas for the harbour, but it was my understanding that the Chinese have leased Newcastle Harbour for 99 years. That's not the case?
We have two sets of owners, and one half is Chinese, China Merchants Ports, which are the largest owners of container ports around the world. They do like 80 million TEUs, which is 10 times more than our whole country, 135 locations around the world. So they're bringing some expertise. And then on the other side, we have Australian super funds through something called the Infrastructure Fund, managed by Macquarie Asset Management. So those are the two sets of directors on our board, and I'm the chair, so I just try and manage the discussion
the
to get to
line.
where we want to go.
So how much say will the Chinese, and theoretically the Chinese government, have in Newcastle Harbour?
They'll have a lot of say, absolutely, because they're the half owners. And so we just have to make sure that things go in the direction that we want, because the FIRB guidelines, have to remind you of Foreign Investment Review Board, the FIRB guidelines require an asset with Chinese or any foreign ownership to be managed and controlled locally. So if it's not managed and controlled locally, FIRB moves in and says, you know, hang on, either you agree to have it managed locally or you go somewhere else.
A question down the back here.
Rick Banyard, I come from correct consultation for Mayfield Group. You might be interested. We don't like coal, and we'd be happy not to have coal as an export. That's basically what our members tell us. But we have done a bit of research just recently to show that the coal exports out of Newcastle will only go down by about 25% by 2050, which is a lot higher. So we're going to have coal be going out of this port for a long time. And our tonnages are probably going to be near record levels for quite a few years to come now. That's the way we see. That's the picture that we got from looking into it and trying to play crystal ball and have a look-see. Our biggest worry though is the rail line itself, and there is one apart from issues with the rail line closely at the port itself, and we're not at all confident that there's any reasonable plan being put forward for that. But the further away from you get the port, the bigger the obstacle is. In 1876, there was a tunnel built up at Ard Glen on the top of the range. That's 30 years before you had your photo with the coal wagons there. That tunnel is in sound condition, but it is grossly overloaded. The first plans to replace that tunnel were drawn up in 1919. So we're a long way over building the tunnel. If that tunnel has a mishap, earthquake, fire, train collision, whatever else, that tunnel will be out of action. And that's like closing the gate to all those people who you're going to export the commodities through. And there doesn't seem to be any plans anywhere to put that tunnel, to do anything about fixing that tunnel up. That tunnel is extremely expensive to us now in all the port users. Anybody who sends their freight over the hill have to use not just the standard engines that normally tow the train, they have to, and take the coal wagons for example, yep, they have to cut the wagons back to about 2/3 of a normal coal train size, and they have to put locos on the back of the train to push it over. So we get as many as 10 locos to push a load of coal or grain over the hill. How's the port going to get the freight to the port if they can't have a rail line capable of delivering it? And it's only, remember, it's only a single line from Muswellbrook to Narrabri.
Yeah, well, I'll have to get the name of that tunnel from you. I know nothing about it. But obviously, if there are obstructions on the way, that would be serious. One of the advantages of our rail network is that we can take trains 1.6 kilometres long. At Port Botany, they can only do 600 to 900 metres. So having long trains and sometimes double stacked is going to be a major competitive advantage for the port, and so we can't have any infrastructure problems like the one you mentioned. So I'll come and see you afterwards and see if I can learn a bit more about that tunnel. On the question of coal exports, I think it would be highly optimistic to say there's a 25% drop by 2050 because we've already seen a 25% drop from a few years ago when it was at 160, 170 million tonnes, and the projection was to go to 200. Well, it went down, and we've just had a spike, as I mentioned earlier, due to Ukraine, etc. But it will, the quarterly energy and resources report from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources is suggesting that that downward slide begins again from next year. So how far it goes and how steep, none of us can say.
Roy, can I first declare that I've worked at Newcastle Port Corporation. Okay. Can I first declare that I've worked at Newcastle Port Corporation and New South Wales Treasury. Right. I enjoyed your history lesson, and I've got no argument with that, except for its starting point. And if you go back to the Mayfield area where Joe Tripodi and Nathan Tinkler wanted to put a coal loading facility in that area of Mayfield. In Treasury, almost anything that goes to Cabinet is seen in Treasury. And one thing that Treasury shakes about is the White Shoe Brigade. And I guess what the question I have to have is, you need to ensure that the parties that are playing in the port are reasonably honourable, because government will walk away if, as was used to be called in Treasury, Newcastle is the dirty port. One interpretation of that is that it carried bulk dirty products, and there's another interpretation which for legal reasons I won't explain to you.
No, absolutely taken on board, and it's a piece of history that I didn't go into there because it would have taken too long, but the Tinkler episode still resonates. Tinkler and Tripodi and Roosendahl, who was then Treasurer. All I would say to everyone is go to your website and look up Newcastle Port ICAC, Tripodi, Tinkler. Just put those into Google and you'll be up all night reading a detective story, which didn't end well for those folks.
I found your talk to be quite interesting. I come from a 40-year background in bulk logistics and shipping and finance with some major resource companies, which involved managing the ships coming to and from Newcastle in terms of volume and coal quality. One of the things that I listened to tonight is the discussion about trains and facilities that you might require to load containers in the north and northwest and certainly the western districts. What about places like Dubbo and that? How do you see them featuring in this new scope for Newcastle? And the big question is, how confident are you that the management of all these loading terminals and rail transport operations will be coordinated correctly? It's a Dorothy Dixon for you.
No, absolutely. No, that's critical to have the coordination there. And Dubbo will feature because Dubbo, plus a number of other sites, will have onshore intermodals, and that's where goods will be centralised for transport. Currently it's mostly on trucks, and we want to get everything we can onto rail and into containers at those sites so that they come into the port ready to go out in a very efficient way through the key crane infrastructure that we will be establishing. There are still quite a few gaps in the rail system, not least of which is actually on the port itself. We've got lots of rail coming into the port. That's the great legacy of having the BHP steel operation there. Unbelievable numbers of great, well-preserved track but there are just some missing pieces that we need to install there, and as well in the regional New South Wales. But Dubbo won't be the first one to get all of that done. We're starting up in the Moree, Narrabri area. That's where the real demand is for a port that can accommodate what they produce, as opposed to sending it to Brisbane and Melbourne.
Roy, the opportunities you've talked about tonight are significant for Newcastle and the Hunter, and I imagine the nation. What planning is in place or is in the future to align the opportunities to ensure housing is available for the workers, to ensure the university and TAFE colleges are aligning their education to the qualifications, trades that are a requirement, the community infrastructure? Is there any thought about the wider implications for the community to ensure we're not put in a position where there are barriers because of the lack of some of those things?
Yeah, a lot of that's going to be have to be driven from here, because one of the problems that will be familiar to everyone is that the New South Wales government is the Sydney Town Council, and they're not interested in the future of housing up here unless it can just take some pressure off Sydney. So it's up to everyone here to plan for the future. The port is doing its bit because we talk to everyone. We talk to the rail companies, we talk to the university, to CSIRO, to TAFE, to the Newcastle City Council, to Lake Macquarie. We go up Hunter, we go and visit everyone up in Muswellbrook. We were up at Moree a couple of weeks ago. So we're talking to everyone we can. Craig Carmody, our CEO, is out there all the time in the Central West and Northern New South Wales. So we can't be faulted for that, but we're not in charge of housing policy or education policy or infrastructure outside our port. So we just have to get everybody working together on this. Committee for the Hunter is one opportunity, plus the JO, the Hunter Councils, all getting together, plus HunterNet. You know, we've got some great representative organisations here, and actually it brings me to a point I didn't make, which was about local content. So here we have these big operations coming here. A lot of it's going to be international companies coming in with their own ideas, their own people, their own supply chains. How do we make sure that there is sufficient local content and opportunities for local manufacturing? And so I'm working with people in the federal government, with the Industry Capability Network, with the Department of Climate Change, Department of Industry, plus all the local organisations, particularly HunterNet, to make sure that we have a plan. And indeed, the Department of Climate Change will be coming here to set up a forum under their so-called offshore wind industrial strategy process, as they call it. And they will be taking soundings here to ensure that we are all connected and able to identify where the opportunities and capabilities are within our local manufacturing ecosystem, together with the university and CSIRO. So the prospects are looking pretty good to get that coordination, but when you go wider than that to housing and so on, yeah, that's something everybody here has to think about.
We have a last question over here.
Excellent. Okay, the last question, probably a good one. You didn't mention anything about nuclear submarine base.
I think that's one of the valuable things about having Chinese shareholders. Very unlikely that they're going to come here.
Are you serious? Is that...
I'm only half joking, but there would be people, you know, in Department of Defence that would see Newcastle as a proposition, but we're recommending Port Kembla if they want to be sure that there isn't any Chinese spying going on.
Okay.
But all of that's still open to discussion. No decisions have been made as far as I know. You know, if the Commonwealth decided overnight Newcastle is the place it would be, we'd have no say in it anyway. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking Roy for what has just been a fascinating presentation tonight.
Thank you.
I think we can go away with some sense of excitement, really, about the opportunities that are possible in Newcastle and the Hunter, and really Australia, from the information and the data that's been presented tonight. It's great to see such forward-thinking things where in the past we haven't always seen that and been weighed down with some of the significant barriers that we've had about, particularly around energy. It's been a fascinating, and I know it's been 6 years since you were here last, but we might be asking you again to come back and talk about the progress of and the related activities that go with that. I think it's a great opportunity. So thank Roy and your team that's helped Rob particularly put this event together. It's a fascinating event tonight. Our next one in August is about cybersecurity. So we have Professor Vijay Varajarajan, I hope I got that right, Rob, who's the Global Innovation Chair at the University of Newcastle and Chief Cyber Strategist at the Newcastle University. He's also the head of the Advanced Cybersecurity Engineering Centre over there. He's going to be talking about, obviously, cybersecurity in the big picture areas. So he's not going to be answering my question about why I get spam in the night. Or about, you know, why things have been hacked. He's going to be talking about the big picture cybersecurity issues. We're really lucky in Newcastle. We've got someone of his capability and international recognition to talk about those things. I know it can be a dry topic, but I think it's something that's going to impact us all as we go forward. He, interestingly, when I was looking at his CV, he led cybersecurity for HP, the Hewlett Packard in Bristol in 1988 to 1995. I think that's when Commodore computers were around. So the fact that they thought about cybersecurity in those days is just amazing. So I think we look forward to that August event, and you'll get notices about it, to talk about that important things that impacts us in a lot more ways than we realise. So thanks again for all coming out tonight on another cold winter's night, and thank you, Roy. A fascinating discussion tonight. Thank you. Yeah, just one more thing. I know a couple of people have faced some hassles over the last couple of months with people living within the 5 kilometre radius of this club to become members. This is the licensing regulation. It hasn't been enforced up to now. We apologise for the difficulties that has caused some people. I think it's 5